Hello, U.S. history students. So today I'm going to talk about Chapter 22, Section 4, and it's 1968. So your discussion question, which will be due on Friday, is basically asking you why 1968 is a watershed moment in American history. Watershed moment means that it has a permanent mark on changing the landscape politically, economically, and or socially. So for example, 1939, the beginning of World War II, or 1941, the United States is bombed at Pearl Harbor. Those are all indelible marks on American history. So let's talk a little bit about 1968. There's three parts to it, okay? So first we have the Tet Offensive about the Vietnam War, the Days of Loss and Rage about assassinations, and then the turbulent race for president. So what I'd like you to do is go into the textbook and be able to answer all of these questions. And as you see, it's organized for you in a very nice, quick way, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the Tet Offensive. So January 30th and 31st of 1968 is basically the Tet Day, which means it's a new year, and it's supposed to be a day of celebration. Okay. And what happens is that you have major attacks across all of South Vietnam by a combination of the North Vietnamese forces, okay, and also the Viet Cong, who, remember, are the Vietnamese in the South Vietnam who are trying to overthrow the government, right, that is backed up by the United States. And you can see here on the map, you see all the parts here, you see the arrows going through, so it's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So the North Vietnamese, who are being held by the Chinese and the Soviet Union, in order for them to get weapons and any other kind of supplies, they went through the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia and had a surprise attack upon the United States. Now, the United States actually suffered a smaller amount of casualties, but what it did is it really changed Americans' perception of the war. They did not trust the government anymore because the government was telling them that the United States was really doing a great job in terms of defeating the Vietnamese. So even though actually on the battlefield the United States won, in public opinion, they lost. Okay? And what this did is had a great impact upon the 1968 presidential election. Okay, so we have Lyndon Johnson, who was the what we call the sitting president. Okay, and he actually decided not to run again because he knew that his actions in Vietnam were quite controversial and that the war wasn't going very well. Okay, and so what you have is a number of people who are going to step into his place that are going to try and run for president. You have Eugene McCarthy, you have Hubert Humphrey, you have Robert Kennedy over here, who is the younger brother of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy, remember, who helped in the negotiations with the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have Hubert Humphrey over here, and then you have George Wallace. So what happens is there's a large amount of controversy at the 1968 Democratic Convention. It seems as if there is no real candidate who says he's going to bring an end to the war quickly. Okay? You have George Wallace over here from Alabama, who basically is fighting for segregation. Okay. And what's going to happen is the Democratic vote will be split. Many Southerners will vote for George Wallace, okay, the Democratic candidate. So that vote gets split. And so what happens is you get a victory by the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. Okay. So let's continue. Early in the year, we have assassinations I should say, Martin Luther King, okay, and also Robert Kennedy. So that's one of the reasons why 1968 is such a watershed year, because we have assassinations of the major civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, and then we have our second member of the Kennedy family assassinated. And many people believe that Robert Kennedy had an excellent chance to be the president. And he was also a president that was fighting, seemed to be more in the forefront of the fight for civil rights than any of the other candidates. Okay, so we know that the anti-Vietnam War protests are growing and growing, and then there were many incidences of distrust. Okay, that the government kept saying the war is going very well, that we're doing a great job. However, on television, you see that there is great amount of difficulties. That just because there's more Vietnamese killed than Americans, Americans are not happy with this war. They're not happy with the draft as well. And at the Democratic Convention, things really, really get out of control and out of hand. Okay. So, what finally ends up happening? Well, in 1968, the election, you see on the map here that Republican Nixon, Richard Nixon, who comes out of nowhere, remember he lost to President John Kennedy in 1960, and he kind of went away for a while. And he comes back in 1968, and he basically says he's the candidate that'll be able to settle down America. He's the candidate that will make the streets safe for America and bring it back to definitely a more conservative era. Okay, so the voting is very close. Hubert Humphrey, who ends up representing the Democratic Party, gets 42%. Nixon only gets 43%. Now, the big deal here is Wallace. Wallace is a Democrat. Now, he formed his own party, and you see that he won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 southern states basically on the idea of keeping segregation. So imagine if Wallace did not do that, then the Democratic votes would have went to Humphrey, and you would have had a Democratic president. So your goal is to respond to the question of why it was such a tumultuous time. How did 1968, how and why did it make a major impact upon American history? Thank you, and I will see you later.